Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Selwyn Rogers. Dr. Rogers is a graduate of the Harvard Medical School, and he has a master's degree in public health from Vanderbilt. He is currently the founding director of the University of Chicago Medicine Trauma Center on the South Side, and it will be the only Level 1 trauma center on the South Side, as I understand, and is scheduled to open in 2018. Dr. Rogers, tell us why this is significant.
The Trauma Center at the University of Chicago Medicine is significant for probably three reasons. First of all, the communities in the South Side of Chicago are an area that have been in need of trauma services for over 25 years, as the last Level 1 Trauma Center closed approximately 25 years ago in 1992. Yeah. Secondly, as we've seen the explosion of gun violence and intentional violence on the south side and west sides of the city of Chicago, it's just a glaring area of need with respect to trauma services. And then the third area, I would say that we really need to address violence as a public health issue to address the proximate or proximal causes of violence in a way that treats violence as a disease that we can intervene and prevent.
So let's explore that. I mean, how do we see violence as a disease, and why is it an issue for a trauma center?
Well, in some ways, if we go back to the definition of what is health, health is not just the absence of infirmity or absence of disease. It's a state of wellness. It's a state of social, physical, emotional, and psychological health that is consistent with the World Health Organization's definition of what health is. In the presence of violence, you can't be healthy. You can't be healthy physically, you can't be healthy emotionally, you can't be healthy psychologically. The other aspect of violence as a disease is that there are risk factors, just like there are risk factors for infectious diseases like a common cold or tuberculosis. And in the context of those risk factors, in the case of violence, the risk factors are poverty, hopelessness, helplessness, homelessness, and those social determinants put people at increased risk of the disease that I'll call violence.
So given this perspective, then the medical community gets involved in trying to change some of those preconditions?
I think that if we look at the holistic perspective of violence as a disease, the analogy that's often touted is one of picking people out of a river that are drowning.
Okay.
But if you go upstream, you try to figure out, well, why are people being thrown in the river in the first place? And so using that analogy, I think we really need to look at the social factors that contribute to putting people at increased risk of violence from a fairly young age and look at the systemic issues and trying to tackle them on the front end as we also take care of patients who've been injured.
And I understand you've moved into a neighborhood that is near where the center is going to go. Is that correct?
Actually, I live in Hyde Park. I live in the South Shore. I'm a proud new member in Kenwood community.
Okay.
I actually had the benefit of voting for the new alderman, and without being political, it was actually just right down the street from my home, so it was easy to vote.
So are you surrounded by people who were victims of violence?
So it's actually very interesting. The question that you just posed is exposing the fact that it is not random who is harmed or shot, for example. But I'm going to broaden that a little bit. When you think about what trauma is, trauma actually comes in the form of what's most dramatic right now, given the over 700 homicides in the city of Chicago, and the sad, unfortunate death just last night of 4 people who were murdered. But trauma also comes in the form of slipping and falling and breaking a leg. Trauma comes in the form of a car accident. Trauma comes in the form of a construction worker who falls off of scaffolding. So it comes in many different forms. The one that you hear about in the news every day is the one that's the most traumatic currently. But there are many different ways you can, or mechanisms that you can get injured. And a trauma center really is a repository or receiver for all those means of trauma in the context of providing care for those patients.
Well, so what is what's the role of race, ethnicity, socioeconomics in creating this environment?
So I don't think we can ignore the fact that the victims of intentional violence specifically are disproportionately men of color.
Yeah.
African American, Hispanic men, often who live in poverty, often who have a high rate of undereducation, underemployment, and all the social factors that contribute to that combination or that constellation of, if you will, symptoms.
Yeah.
And then violence or crime becomes a factor. I quoted Aristotle recently. Recently, my kids are teaching me about tweeting. Not something that I do routinely, but I tweeted a quote that I came across from Aristotle that said that poverty, where there is poverty, there's revolution or crime. And in many ways, the poverty that leads people to challenging sets of decisions for which almost anyone placed in those complex interplay of race, ethnicity, discrimination, lack of access to care and services will lead to certain sets of decisions. And one of the, I think, amazing opportunities that we have at a place like the University of Chicago with our arts and humanities and psychology and sociology and schools, social services administration and economic schools, is putting all of those disciplines on one campus to bear on an issue like public safety and intentional violence and trying to tackle these complex problems that need really big solutions. And those complex problems that need big solutions can't be tackled in a silo. You almost need to look at intersectionability. How do these different parts of poverty, homelessness, lack of education contribute to a system that leads to the results that we see today?
Well, that quote from Aristotle seems to be more of a sort of a rational option. You know, it's like if I'm feeling repressed, then I can oppose the system by participating in a revolution, right? Or I can take advantage of weaknesses in the system to try to break even here, right? But there are elements that you're looking at, I'm sure, that don't have to do with thinking through options or being rational. They have to do with things that we have less control over, right?
And I think that's a great point that I would frame this way.
Yeah.
We know from our veterans, our service men and women who have come back from Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the campaigns with the Korean War. My brother, in fact, is a psychiatric nurse practitioner who served our country. One of the things that's amazing about that is that we've actually come to realize that there is post-traumatic stress disorder. That is a set of stressors, war, loss, leads to stress. But what if you're in a situation from a young age where at 2 you saw someone who's a victim of violence? At 13, a classmate of yours in school was a victim of violence and died. At 16, your best friend was killed. That's not post-traumatic stress. That's actually present traumatic stress, ongoing stress.
Maybe having a similar impact on your
That's having developmental impacts with how our brains are wired, but also when there's not interventions to address the mental health stressors, what happens is probably a combination of factors that leads to, at times, rage, impulse, lack of impulse control, a degree of automaticity that we actually don't really study really well, nor do we fully understand resilience. Because even though many people
maybe also a sense of being defeated and not wanting to, not mustering the defenses that you might normally have too, right?
True. And I think that the other thing that we don't know well, and I'm speaking from a sociocultural, biological perspective, is there are people who live through very traumatic life experiences, but yet still are incredibly resilient.
Well, you know, that's interesting. There's a faculty member here from China, and she was in school during the Cultural Revolution. And, you know, we think of, you know, how we protect our children when they're in school, and if, you know, something happens, the counselors come in and talk to them. Well, I think she said she was in first grade. It was her first year in school, and the kids from the high school came in and grabbed her teacher and took him outside and tried him and hung him in front of everybody. She's, you know, she has a Ph.D. She runs programs for the university. She's got a very positive personality. She's an inspiration to a lot of us. But you know, she told me that story one night. I was driving her to a meeting, and I just, you know, ever since that, I thought, well, how does someone get from there to here? But some people do, right? And some people don't. They get caught up in it, and it affects all of the other decisions they make in their lives. So what does the hospital do to get involved in that process? Because all that happens outside. I come in, I've got a gunshot wound, you treat the gunshot wound, you send me back out into the community. How do you impact those other things?
I think at the University of Chicago Medicine, because we're building this trauma center from the ground floor up, there's incredible opportunities to bring to bear best practices across the country. For example, hospital-based violence recovery programs that wrap around services at the teaching moment shortly after the trauma provide.
For instance?
So, for example, a 17-year-old half a year away from getting his GED gets involved in some place that he probably shouldn't be, gets shot. He gets admitted to the hospital. The trauma of that shooting is real. Right? But then on top of it, if we can scratch the surface of the mental health issues that are normal reactions to that stress, and engage that young man beyond just we've repaired your bleeding blood vessel or your fractured bone, and we're going to focus on your wellness. We're going to help you transition back into your community, or if it's actually safer, not back into your community, but someplace else. That's the holistic approach that we hope to employ at the University of Chicago Medicine.
Okay, very good. We're going to take a quick break, and the Calumet Roundtable will be right back, and we'll finish this discussion. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Dr. Selwyn Rogers, and we are discussing a new Level 1 Trauma Center, which will open in 2018 on Chicago's South Side, being sponsored by the University of Chicago. Dr. Rogers, what happened to us? I think I remember when I was younger that hospitals took everyone who needed help and cared for them, and if you couldn't pay for it, you still received the treatment. I know of a case of a young man who, rough neighborhood, was selling cocaine, sold somebody some bad cocaine. They came back, they beat him up. He had broken bones and was just really unconscious for a long time. And his mother drove him around for 2 days. And I know this because I know the family, right? Drove him around for 2 days before she could find a hospital that would take him in. How did we get to that point? What's the state of our system that it's so dependent on money?
Well, that's such a sad story because clearly the system is broken. A kid like that should have just been taken care of by the very first hospital that the mom brought him to. I'm at a loss for words to understand the lack of humanity that allowed that to happen. Now,
he was in and out of hospitals a lot.
Sure.
So, they'd seen him before, but they refused treatment.
But by the same token, we have to treat everyone with dignity. If I can digress just for a second, because it's not going to be a long digression. Not touting any individual book, but there's a book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe.
Yeah.
And it's a great book, very short primer. It's about this issue of what tribe do you belong to? And it actually ties in with this issue of intentional violence, because the book goes into this idea that people can suffer traumatic events in their lives.
Yeah.
Severe war, loss, rape, lots of things.
Yeah.
But if they have a sense of community, if they belong to a tribe, it can propel them forward. Somehow we've lost some of that tribe, where it's not just my tribe or your tribe, but the tribe of humanity. Because if we had that communal tribe, we wouldn't let people not get taken care of when they when they have needs.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, did things change? I mean, does it seem that way to me, or is that a fact?
I think that there has been clearly more concern raised about the cost of providing health care, not necessarily health.
Well, but let's look at the fact that it's been 25 years since there was a trauma center on the South Side, right? Why?
So,
because there were trauma centers there, right? And they're not there anymore.
Right. So I get the benefit of saying I
Yeah.
don't fully know, since
Okay.
I've been at the
course.
University of Chicago
Right.
for all of 61 days. But I can.
But this isn't unusual.
But I can
Yeah.
say that
Yeah.
we don't always provide services as a system or non-system of healthcare where the services are needed.
Yeah.
But I think that there's also something else going on when our gross domestic product, the percentage that's being expended on healthcare delivery services,
Yeah.
continues to grow and grow. And then President Trump just put out a new replacement of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
So the word affordable is in the act, but we clearly have some challenges around creating an affordable healthcare system. So not putting myself on a political platform, I think that there's some challenges around how we talk about valuing health. And in some ways, we probably are focusing a little too much on provision of health services and not on keeping people healthy. What I mean by that,
Okay.
probably half of the things that we see, cardiovascular disease, trauma, if we address behavioral, mental health, social determinants of disease, we could actually impact the health of populations in a way that's more fundamentally sound than treating disease after it emerges. Be that disease cancer, be that disease heart disease, be that disease violence.
So what are some ways that we would do that? How would we?
So
preliminary treatment things.
You're
yes.
putting me on the spot, and I'm going to go back to proximity.
Okay.
If we look at the proximate causes of social ills, income inequality, poverty, there was just a recent story in the Chicago papers that may have come across the transom in Indiana around a family where 9 children were in a house, no food, no heat,
Right.
alone.
I saw that. Yeah.
How do we let that and I'm not blaming the parents because they're probably doing the best that they can, but how do we as a society, especially a society of one of the richest countries in the world, allow families to be in that predicament? And then on top of it, what's the trajectory for those children? Because last time I checked, it's pretty hard to learn if you're hungry. It's pretty hard to aspire for an audacity of hope if you're hopeless. And I think that's some of the real soul-searching discussions that are uncomfortable that we need to have as a society.
Well, how do you see us getting to that point then? I mean, these aren't new issues. And it seems, especially if we look at this last election, we weren't talking about how we can help one another more in this election. We were talking about how we can get more for ourselves, essentially, right?
So I'm going to say that one of the challenges that we have is that we don't see each other for who we are. So when an 11-year-old girl, and 12-year-old girl, and a 2-year-old boy get shot and die on the south side and west sides of Chicago.
Yeah.
For whom does that bell toll? It should toll for all of us. We should all be in horror. We should all be aghast, not just the families that have been impacted, and every family. The 11-year-old girl, 12-year-old girls are usually in 5th grade,
Yeah.
4th, 5th grade. It's been a while.
Yeah.
My kids are 21,
Junior high maybe, yeah,
14,
somewhere in there,
and 18. And so you're just at the cusp of going from elementary school to junior high.
Yeah.
I would challenge us to think about, what are those kids going to learn this year? What are the mental health services that those kids
Yeah.
deal with the present stress that they're living through?
Yeah.
And I guess I'm not trying to give you a non-answer. I'm just trying to give you a holistic answer that treating the symptom, treating the
Yeah.
gunshot graze, treating the cancer after it happens,
Right.
probably is not the best investment of our resources. Not that we shouldn't be doing that now, but we should also be tackling
Right.
upstream before we throw people in the water.
But you would agree that in order to address those things as a society, we need to build some kind of a consensus that that's the kind of nation we need to be. Those are the kinds of people that we want to be, right?
I would agree wholeheartedly.
But it seems to me that our public consciousness, our public discussion, our public sense of who we are has moved away from that position, not towards it in the last few years.
And I think that point is exactly what we need to address. We need increased awareness. We need increased activism around what our values are, even if the values are the value to disagree respectfully. I have friends who are Republicans. I have friends who are conservative. I actually engage in dialogue to try to advance that. What are our shared goals as citizens, not just of the United States, of the world?
Yeah.
What is our duty to each other? Get back to that issue of tribe and community. One of the things that struck me growing up is, if I did something bad 2 miles from my house,
Yeah.
my aunt chastised me on the way home,
Yeah.
my grandmother chastised me halfway home,
Yeah.
and then my mother had found out pre-cell phones
Before you get there.
before I got there. That's a community where people take care of each other, where people care about each other. Because in that caring about each other, as a young child, you learn values. You learn things that it's actually great to actually help somebody else, because that's actually a good thing. That helps me too. Because when I'm down, somebody helps me.
Yeah. Well, but how can somebody impact that? Because these are changes that have happened gradually over a period of time. The situation you're describing is no longer the case, because people move because of jobs, because apartment buildings get torn down. They get dispersed into places where they're anonymous, members of the community. Is there some way to impact that? I mean, I think we're kind of talking about some of the inevitabilities of the 21st century, right?
So I don't think that we've actually done a great job of using all the tools. I'll take, for example, this crowdsourcing that social media does. So literally, somehow, there was this incredible event that happened on January 21st. All across the globe, for a common cause, people got together with pink hats on. What if we crowdsourced education? What if we crowdsourced, that is, using tools that we know or connect us instead of keeping us apart? Then the other thing I would say is, there needs to be some re-social engineering about this issue of community. And again, I don't want to go off too much on a tangent about this idea of community. But when you care about somebody else, whether or not they are related to you, there's a chance that you can actually have a different conversation because you're close to the problem. As a physician, a trauma surgeon, I cannot diagnose your problem from across this room. I got to get close to you. I got to touch you. How much of that touching are we doing today? Where people actually are getting intimate with someone else, sharing their life story.
Yeah.
In my role as a teacher, I challenge my quote-unquote students, be it medical students or residents, all the time with simple questions. Who's in their family? Do they have a pet? Do they have a grandmother? And it's amazing how, as people start having those type of questions and dialogues beyond the biomedical with their patients, they find that they're rewarded, that they feel more fulfilled, that they're actually doing something of meaning, because it's no longer bed 8, it's no longer appendicitis in room 24. Right. It's someone who's dealing with a critical illness for which you as a physician or a nurse or a psychotherapist can actually help them through a part of the journey of their life.
You know, that's a very compelling argument, but you know, on the other side of that, I think about how, you know, profit has been a big influencer in how we treat one another, and the threat of lawsuits perhaps keeping physicians from saying things that maybe they otherwise feel like they need to say or would want to say to people. What's going on to change the constraints that are being put on this by, you know, by the fact that it costs a couple $100,000 to get your medical degree, and that you could be sued, and that hospitals have rules about what you can say and can't say? What's going on at that level?
Well, I'm going to say that we currently on a path that we all agree is unsustainable. And
okay.
So it's a path where we can't keep crowding out schools and law enforcement and fire departments and so many other things, highways,
yeah,
public safety,
yeah,
with healthcare. And so because we are on an unsustainable growth curve of healthcare spending, I think there's a chance for us to, I'm going to use the word pivot, to a different way of doing what we've done for a long time, which is more units of service,
yeah,
instead of what care can you provide people to make their lives healthier.
Very good. We'll end with the pivot theory. I like that. That is all the time we have for our program. Thank you for joining me on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.